Welcome to the Voice of the Beginning, the Word of the Bible. Before we begin, help us spread the word. Subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share with those you love.
Humanity still felt, like an open wound in their memory, the scent of damp earth and the fragrance of flowers that never withered in paradise. Yet, waking up was different now. The sun, which once caressed creation, now burned the skin of Adam and Eve with an unknown and hostile intensity. As they crossed the gates of Eden, they didn't just leave a garden behind. They left behind an absolute harmony where simply being was enough. Outside the boundaries of the sacred life, ceased to be a passive gift and became a bitter conquest torn from a soil that seemed to resist human presence. Amidst thorns, thistles, and the kind of exhaustion that buckles the knees, it is in this setting of profound nostalgia where the silence of God seems to echo louder than his voice that two brothers are born. They are two promises of continuity, carrying in their spiritual DNA the fundamental duality of our post-fall existence. Cain, the firstborn, emerges under the expectation of being a redeemer, his very name evoking possession and acquisition. He becomes a man of the earth, the tiller who plunges his hands into dry clay to wring out a living. Cain represents the strength of the human arm, the technical skill that tries, at all costs, to reconstruct a lost order through material mastery. He is the symbol of effort that refuses to accept lack, the man who believes that if he works the land hard enough, he can recreate his own private paradise. Spiritually, Cain personifies self-sufficiency, the dangerous belief that we are the architects of our own survival and that nature is merely an object to be bent to our will. In contrast, Abel emerges with the gentleness of a shepherd, one who does not seek to dominate the land but to walk upon it in harmony with all that breathes. While Cain deals with the inanimate, Abel tends to vulnerable life, symbolizing contemplation and the acceptance of our dependence as created beings. In Abel's shepherding, there is an implicit recognition that life is a breath that does not belong to us. He observes the cycle of birth and death, keeping his heart in tune with the fragility of existence. Abel is the spirit that still looks to the heavens for guidance, while Cain looks to the ground for control. This divergence of inclinations was not merely a choice of profession, but a geography of the soul. Spiritually, this beginning shows us that the violence that would mar human history does not spring from nothing, like a sudden accident. It germinated silently in the vacuum left by the absence of God's manifest glory. The moment man begins to see himself as the absolute master of his own destiny, forgetting that the land he tills and the air he breathes still belong to the Creator, the ego begins to swell. Cain's tragedy starts with his refusal to be a receiver of grace, preferring instead to be the lord of his own sweat. The conflict that follows is the reflection of an internal imbalance. When the human ambition to control matter outweighs the spiritual humility of recognizing divine sovereignty, the stage is set for the first great rupture of brotherhood. The story of these two brothers is, in truth, the story of the two forces battling within each of us, the will to possess and the courage to trust. As time passed, the distance between man and the Creator began to weigh heavily upon the shoulders of the two brothers. There is a void in the human soul that nothing on earth can fill, and the inevitable moment arrives when the soul feels an urgent need to reconnect with the sacred, to raise an altar in the middle of the desert of existence. Cain and Abel prepare their sacrifices. But what unfolds on that field of worship is one of the most profound lessons on the anatomy of intention. We must understand that, in the realm of the spirit, a sacrifice is never defined by the material value of the object placed upon the stone, nor by the aesthetic beauty of the gift, but by the flame burning in the most secret and darkest chambers of the heart of the one who offers it. The altar is merely a mirror of what has already taken place within a person long before the offering is ever presented. Cain, the master of the soil, brings the fruits of his exhaustive labor. He selects what the ground produced under his command and presents to God the result of his technique, his intelligence, and his personal power. For Cain, sacrifice was a transactional way to display to God what he had achieved. He did not bring an offering of gratitude, but a report of his own efficiency. There was a silent vanity there. He presented to God the byproduct of his self-sufficiency, as if the Creator should be impressed by the sweat of his brow. Cain offered what was external to him while keeping his inner world locked away. He gave to God what he had, but refused to surrender who he was. Abel, on the other hand, approaches the altar with a radically opposite disposition. He brings the firstborn of his flock, the first, the best, the fat, and the blood. By offering the life of a creature, Abel was symbolically acknowledging that life belongs exclusively to God, and that he, Abel, was merely a humble guardian of a mystery he could not create. Abel's offering was an act of total surrender. He did not bring what was left over, nor what was convenient. He brought the beginning, the sacred, that which was most precious to him. While Cain offered the fruit of his strength, Abel offered the recognition of his own weakness and dependence. The spiritual chasm here is vast and serves as a warning for all generations. God's gaze did not incline toward Abel's offering out of some arbitrary preference or a greater fondness for shepherds over farmers. The divine eye penetrates matter to find intent. God accepted Abel because Abel had already surrendered himself upon the altar of his spirit before he ever touched the animal. Abel let go of himself, his ego, and his pretensions. Cain, however, kept his pride intact, expecting God to be merely a passive spectator of his personal glory. The acceptance of one and the rejection of the other were not acts of favoritism, but the natural reaction of the spirit to truth versus falsehood. Cain wanted to use God to validate his work. Abel wanted God to accept his life. In the silence that followed as the smoke rose from one altar and stagnated over the other, the great crisis of humanity was revealed. The difference between religion that seeks to bargain with the divine and spirituality that seeks to lose itself in him. The moment the fire from heaven rests upon Abel's altar and silence hangs over Cain's offering, something breaks definitively within the firstborn. It wasn't merely the absence of a divine sign. It was the birth of a dense, suffocating shadow that began to project itself from the depths of his soul onto the outside world. We must understand that envy, at its spiritual root, is far more than the simple desire to possess the goods or success of another. It is the metaphysical agony of witnessing someone else being loved, accepted, and validated in a dimension of intimacy with the sacred that we by our own choices and hardness of heart feel incapable of reaching. Cain's pain was not caused by a lack of harvest, but by the presence of grace in Abel's life. Instead of Cain lifting his eyes to the heights in a gesture of humility to ask the Creator, "Father, what is wrong with my heart? How can I draw closer to you?" he commits the fatal error that defines the fall of humanity. He averts his gaze from God and fixes it upon his brother. He stops seeking transcendence only to lose himself in horizontal comparison. The sacred text uses an expression of overwhelming psychological depth when it says, "His countenance fell." Spiritually, this means the connection between Cain's soul and the divine light was severed. When the face falls, the vision becomes heavy, turned toward the ground, toward the dust, toward mere matter. The light that should have illuminated his expression is replaced by the opacity of resentment. Image showing Cain's face darkening and his gaze shifting from the sky to Abel when we stop looking upward. Our perception of reality becomes purely horizontal and, consequently, predatory. The existence of the other ceases to be a cause for celebration and becomes a threat to our own importance. Envy acts as a poison that distorts the image of our neighbor. The brother, who should have been a companion on the journey, is transfigured into a competitor and, finally, into an obstacle that must be removed. To the envious heart, the universe becomes a zero-sum game, where one believes that the happiness and radiance of another are the direct cause of their own darkness. The spiritual lesson here is sharp and urgent. Human violence does not begin with a clenched fist or a drawn weapon. It begins much earlier, in a gaze darkened by malicious comparison. When we allow a neighbor's prosperity, or a brother's altar, to become the measure of our worth, we are handing the keys of our peace over to the destroyer. Cain interprets Abel's spiritual success as his own personal defeat, and in that barren soil of bitterness, the seed of violence finds the perfect fertilizer to flourish. He does not hate Abel for what Abel did, but for who Abel is before God, proving that envy is ultimately a war against the sovereignty of the Creator himself. Even in the face of a heart already seething with hatred, the divine does not withdraw. God, in his infinite and unfathomable mercy, does not abandon Cain to his own dark resentment, but descends to the level of human anguish for a final dialogue of warning. It is not a cry of condemnation, but a question from a father seeking to bring his son back to the light. "Why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen?" The voice that knows all does not ask for lack of information, but to force Cain to face the abyss he has dug within himself. God reveals to Cain the spiritual anatomy of evil, describing sin not as an abstract concept, but as a living, predatory force. Sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you. In this powerful metaphor, sin is presented as a beast lurking on the threshold of the soul, hidden in the shadows of the conscience, waiting only for a moment of weakness and invitation from the ego to deliver its fatal strike. God establishes here the final and absolute boundary of free will, but you must master it. Spiritually, this moment represents that eternal second of silence that precedes every great fall. It is the divine conscience shouting within each of us before the irreparable mistake. God was teaching Cain that feelings, anger, envy, frustration are guests knocking at the door, but man holds the key to the entrance. Sin is not an inevitable destiny, nor an irresistible force to which we are victims. It is a deliberate choice to drop one's guard and allow chaos to settle where there should be order. Cain is warned with crystal clarity that his anger is not just an emotional state, but a gateway to the destruction of everything he loves and of himself. However, the mystery of iniquity lies in the fact that Cain's pride has become so vast and rigid that he feels insulted by divine counsel itself. To Cain, God's correction sounds like a new rejection. In his distorted mind, he believes he has a faster and more effective solution for his pain. If the problem is comparison, he will eliminate the source of that comparison. He ignores the warning of the beast at the door because, in spirit, he has already become one with the beast. This chapter of history teaches us that God always offers a way out, always points out the danger, and always extends his hand before the impact. but he never violates the tragic freedom of man to choose his own ruin. Cain's silence before God is the prelude to the sound of the first blood hitting the earth. Cain's invitation for Abel to accompany him to the field was not a gesture of reconciliation, but the first act of dark premeditation in human history. In that simple phrase, "Let us go to the field," one hears the echo of a betrayal that shatters the most sacred trust, the bond of blood. Cain needed isolation. He needed a place where his parents' gaze could not reach and where the voice of God might, in his delusion, seem further away. On that vast and silent horizon, where only the sky stood witness and the wind blew through the grain, humanity's first murder was committed. There was no army, no declared warnly, the arm of one brother against the chest of another. The moment Abel's life was cut short, his blood touched the virgin soil, and a terrifying silence, a vacuum of horror, fell over all of creation. The earth, which was meant to be the cradle of life, became the first grave, drinking a liquid it was never intended to know. Spiritually, this act represents the desperate and tragic attempt of the human being to resolve internal crisis, anguish, inadequacy, and the sting of rejection through the destruction of the external world. Cain operated under a perverse spiritual logic. He believed that by removing Abel from existence, he would eliminate the mirror that reflected his own failure. He imagined that without his brother's radiance, he would be the only one, the most important, the absolute center of God's attention and favor. But spiritual reality is relentless. Evil never fills the void, it only expands it. The instant Abel ceased to breathe, Cain did not feel the satisfaction of triumph, but rather the crushing weight of an isolation that no human power could heal. By killing his brother, Cain committed a partial spiritual suicide. He killed the part of himself that was capable of loving and being loved. He tore the invisible fabric of universal brotherhood, that mystical connection that unites all beings under the fatherhood of the Creator. Violence is presented here as the great illusion of the ego, the lie that eliminating another can bring peace to one who carries hell within. The field of blood became ground zero for our history of pain, proving that when man attempts to become the master of life and death, he ends up a prisoner of his own crime. What remained in that field was not a victor, but a dead man and a lost man, both victims of the belief that hatred can heal the wounds of the soul. After the crime, the silence of the field is shattered by a voice that cannot be ignored. "Where is Abel, your brother?" God asks. This is not an investigative question, for the eyes of the omnipresent watched every movement of Cain's hand. Rather, it is a desperate invitation to redemption. God, in his pedagogy of love, offers Cain a golden opportunity. Confession. By asking where, God is opening a door for Cain to look within himself and acknowledge his fall. But Cain's heart is already petrified. His response, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" is not merely a lie. It is a manifesto of cynicism that has echoed through the millennia as the ultimate slogan of human selfishness. In this sentence, Cain attempts to abdicate the moral responsibility we hold for one another, declaring that the well-being of our neighbor is none of our business. He attempts to sanctify indifference. However, the sin committed in the secrecy of the field possesses a voice of its own. God declares that the voice of Abel's blood is crying out from the ground. There is a metaphysics to divine justice. Creation itself cannot bear the weight of injustice. The earth, which was once Cain's pride, his ally, and his source of wealth, now becomes his accuser. By drinking Abel's blood, the soil closes itself off to Cain. It will no longer yield its strength to the tiller. Spiritually, this teaches us that the evil we practice against our neighbor poisons the very environment in which we live. The verdict is not an arbitrary sentence, but a statement of fact. Cain has become a fugitive and a wanderer. Whoever sheds the blood of their fellow man loses their root in the cosmos. He becomes a stranger everywhere, unable to find rest in the nature he profaned or in the divine presence he rejected. Cain's punishment is, in reality, the externalization of his internal state. He is not cast out by a vengeful God, but exiled by his own impossibility of remaining at peace. To wander and stray is the condition of every soul that separates itself from the source of life. It is the existential fatigue of those who seek meaning outside of harmony with the Creator and their brother. Cain is condemned to live in Nod, a word that means wandering. Nod is not just a geographical point, but a state of mind where the heart never finds a home, where security is an illusion, and where the fear of being discovered replaces the joy of being known. Cain's exile is a portrait of the modern soul, surrounded by material conquests, yet eternally homeless, walking aimlessly because the voice of brotherhood has been silenced. The story of Cain does not end with a bolt of lightning or a strike of destruction, but with a mystery that defies our human understanding of justice. The mark of Cain. Upon being sentenced to exile, the first murderer experiences a profound terror not for the sin he committed, but for the consequences he must now endure. "My punishment is greater than I can bear," he cries out, fearing that in the wilderness of the world, anyone who finds him will kill him to avenge Abel. It is here that the narrative reaches its spiritual pinnacle. In a gesture that scandalizes the logic of retaliation, God places a sign of protection upon Cain. Even the man who introduced death into the world is not abandoned to the fury of blind vengeance. The mark of Cain is not merely a stigma of shame or a scar of infamy. It is, fundamentally, a seal of mercy that interrupts the infinite and destructive cycle of violence. By protecting Cain, God establishes that life belongs to him alone, and that divine justice does not seek the annihilation of the wanderer, but the preservation of existence so that, in the time of exile, repentance might finally flourish. Spiritually, this teaches us that there is no darkness so dense that grace cannot penetrate it. The mark tells the world that final judgment does not belong to men, but to the Creator. Cain leaves the presence of the Lord in exile far deeper than any geographical distance, settles in the land of Nod. There he attempts to fill the void in his soul by building cities, fathering lineages, and developing civilizations based on technology and self-defense. He carries with him the scar of his choice, becoming the father of a humanity that tries to save itself through its own efforts, yet lives under the heavy weight of constant fear. The story of Cain and Abel is, ultimately, the clearest mirror of our own souls. It reveals that we are capable of the worst crimes, the most destructive envy, and the coldest denial of brotherhood. However, it also reveals that even at the furthest point of our wandering, we are still watched over by a providence that prevents us from losing ourselves entirely in the darkness we created. Cain's legacy is the warning that sin lurks at the door, but Cain's mark is the promise that God still waits for our return. As we conclude this journey, we are invited to look at our own hands and our own altars, choosing whether we will be guardians of life or prisoners of our own envy. The origin of human violence is the forgetting that we are all brothers. The origin of our redemption is the remembrance that, even as a Cain, we are still loved by the Father.
May this word take root in your spirit and guide your steps. If this message spoke to you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.